Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm very happy to see so many familiar faces here today. We are the White City Center, the Liebling House, and this is our research lab. The White City Center is a collaboration of the Tel Aviv municipality and the German government in form of the Interior Ministry. And we are a center for architecture, conservation, and urbanism in the White City of Tel Aviv. And every week we bring you interesting lectures and researches that we do in our lab, or just topics that are very contemporary and that we find will contribute to this international discourse that we're doing in architecture. So the Liebling House is still closed, but will open soon in the middle of next month with some great exhibition. Slowly make tours and all.
Sharon, I cannot hear you. You're frozen and I've lost you. I don't know if anyone else can see Sharon, but I can't. Alan, can you hear me?
Yeah, she is lost. My screen said she lost her connection. The rest of us are here, but I'm hoping she's going to realize she was cut off and she'll get back on.
Oh, yeah.
If anyone can connect with her directly, please let her know.
Any other host here? Any responsible adult in the room?
Just us kids.
Yeah, just kids.
Just us children.
Okay. Should I otherwise start the lecture if people can hear me?
Sure.
Lily, okay. Ines, okay. I will start the lecture then. Yeah, I'm sorry to do this to Sharon, but okay. Okay, so can you see my screen? Culture and memory, how to preserve historical satellite. You do not see the little pictures on top, huh? I hope.
No,
okay.
We see this. We see the slide. Okay,
so I'm going to start with the Liebling House. This is how we like to remember the Bauhaus, of course. But there's also another side to the Bauhaus. And here we have a drawing that's actually Yad Vashem. I take a little pride in this drawing because I helped negotiate the transfer to Yad Vashem 12 years ago. The original location of Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is the first draft of a plan for Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was drawn by a guy called Fritz Ertl, and Fritz Ertl got his architecture education at the Bauhaus. So between the Liebling House and Auschwitz-Birkenau, obviously there is a relationship. So now I'm frozen. So I'm going to talk about, I start out with talking about some issues in preservation in Auschwitz. And this has to do really, because somewhere there was a mix-up, I think, in messages about what my lecture was going to be about. I want to talk about the evidence room, which is an exhibition that we brought to Venice and which has been on show recently at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. But then also I was invited on the basis of an article I wrote about Auschwitz. So it's going to be a little bit of a mix and match here. But here in Ariel...
Yeah, Robert, can I still introduce you? I'm sorry. I just want to introduce you if it's fine with you. Is that okay? Sure. I'm sorry that I'm disrupting you, but it's important, I think, that everybody knows who you are. No. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Sure. So Robert, I want to introduce you in a very unconventional manner. And from your research, I understand that your main focus is actually sort of the idea of facial construction or deadly architecture in a sense. So you are researching since the 90s the subject of what is the biggest crime ever committed by an architect, which I found personally such a relevant topic, especially today when the generation of Auschwitz survivors and Holocaust survivors at large is almost completely perished. So if I go a little bit back, then I read that you had actually an encounter with the subject because your father was a physician, and he was confronted with the subject in 1945 when he went to school as a doctor, and he was confronted with the crimes of doctors in Dachau. And what you found especially interesting is actually what are the biggest crimes of architects or architecture as it is. So this is, I find, very, very relevant to the discourse of architecture nowadays. Also, especially, the subject is very relevant as anti-Semitism is also in the rise again in Germany and in other places. But also a lot of human crimes are committed all over the world. So your research is, since the 90s, even more relevant today as you speak. And I would also like to introduce you as not only the curator of one of the curators of the White Room at the Architecture Biennale of 2016, I'm sorry, but also the curator of the Making Auschwitz exhibition at the Museum of the Jewish Heritage in New York. And you, of course, published a lot of articles and books, and you are very active as a professor and a teacher. So I would like to thank you again for joining us today. And I want to encourage everybody who is listening to write questions in the chat, and later we can discuss them with Robert in person. And also joining us will be Dr. Orit Shacham-Gover. She's a curator and a writer, and also the main curator of the Jewish Museum of Bet-Futzot. So sorry for disturbing you again, and thank you so much for joining us, Robert. Please continue.
Okay, my apologies for just starting. I think that the protocols for how to do this kind of lecture with the possibility of interruptions are not yet well established. Any case, I had a lecture recently, and I talked for half an hour, not knowing that my internet here in the home had collapsed. So we'll try. Okay, so I'm going to start with just this aerial photo of Auschwitz. You see the Auschwitz main camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Auschwitz the town during the war, Oswiecim today, the IG Farben, and Auschwitz-Monowitz. And again, we are frozen for a moment. I don't know why. This is a real problem. Okay, so today, the yellow parts are part of the Auschwitz Museum. Yeah, so the Auschwitz main camp and around 2/3 of what was Birkenau during the Holocaust is a museum. But there are many other sites that are actually very important in the history of Auschwitz that are not included. Auschwitz-Monowitz, where Primo Levi and some 30,000 other Jews were imprisoned and suffered and died. IG Farben, the great factory, a part of Auschwitz main camp, the Alte Judenrampe, and many sub-camps are not included in the camp. And in fact, a third of Birkenau is not included. These are the red dots. So I'm going to travel through 3 of these sites to show you what's not included in Auschwitz right now, what is not protected by UNESCO, what is not also conserved. First, IG Farben. There's a lot left there. In fact, until 5 years ago, it was still a going enterprise. So when you go to IG Farben, this is all built by Germans. This was all built by slave labor. This was actually the reason that the Germans started pouring money into the town of Auschwitz in 1941. It's all there, but it's not marked. There are the air raid shelters also for the Germans, both IG Farben personnel, SS and others, which are all there. Again, nothing is actually formally indicated what it is, or there is no preservation policy. When you go to Auschwitz-Monowitz, the camp, nothing of the camp remains, except when you start looking closely at the houses there. This is in December 2012, and you go around with my favorite cab driver, and he knows everyone. And this obviously is constructed out of German barrack parts of the Reichsarbeitsdienstmannschaft-Baracke. These are the elements of this thing. And when you go inside to the back, you actually find more or less intact a Krankenstube, a sick bay of the Auschwitz-Monowitz camp. When 2 years later we came back to this site to have another look, that second part of the barrack with all of the inscriptions was actually removed. Nothing was there. This is typical for what's happening in this area. Things are there, and then suddenly they've disappeared. They've been picked up by a collector. Now, in fact, I'm somewhat guilty of that myself also, because a year later, I was back again at that site, and my cab driver friend had told me of another person who actually owned a barrack. They had gotten this in 1945 to compensate for a farm that had been destroyed to build the factory. This, again, an original German barrack. We bought it for the Auschwitz exhibition that's now in New York. This is, by the way, as it was displayed in Madrid. We restored it, and it's now an important exhibit. So there's actually quite a trade going on in that area of Auschwitz artifacts, important Auschwitz artifacts, which are being bought, sold, negotiated, restored. There's almost like a gray market of it. And it's a very weird thing, but all of this is outside of the protected zone of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. So if we now go to closer to the Auschwitz main camp, and I show you the red dot is actually, you can see these buildings from the parking place of the museum. Of course, everyone in Oswiecim always refers to Auschwitz as the museum, which brings one good friend of mine whose grandfather was in Auschwitz to say, my grandfather didn't spend 3 years in the museum between 1942 and 45. But those yellow buildings at the back were actually concentration camp barracks. And they are now houses. There's a church in there and so on. They're part of the historical camp designed by German architects in 1942, constructed in 1943 and 44, included even rooms for medical experiments, but they're not part of the museum. If we go back now to the museum itself, that is the official part that is protected, and that is a museum. And so we now go to a somewhat larger scale. And so the yellow is part of, is the protected part. Of course, this is the aspect, the approach to the gate of the camp that many people who've been there will have walked here. The Arbeit macht frei gate. Again, this is a December day in 2012. Everything is relatively well preserved. The buildings are well preserved. But inside those buildings, of course, there is a terrible struggle to preserve stuff that actually is not meant to last for a very long time. The hair, but also the shoes. I mean, tens of thousands of shoes, and there, of course, the leather is rotting. And so the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum is really involved in a heroic enterprise to try to preserve this stuff. Again, much of it was of low quality to start with. I mean, typically, people who were deported to Auschwitz, Jews in 1942 to 44, had been robbed of all of the good things already. So it's a miracle that these shoes still survive. But of course, if you think about the conditions under which these things are stored, it's very, very difficult to preserve them. The Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum is now world famous, thanks to enormous investment in their labs, for having the largest experience in the preservation of very low quality material in the world. That is, documents created on wartime paper, which were only using really the worst kind of wood pulp and so on. The stuff that basically that was brought there and which the Germans themselves didn't find valuable enough to recycle. That in some way are the treasures of that camp. And as I said, it's an enormous amount of effort and science and financial investment is needed to preserve the decay. The Auschwitz Museum, the Auschwitz landscape, it's a very complex landscape. So if we're looking now at what's known as the Alte Judenrampe, that is the selection place where transports of Jews from June 1942 up to May 1944 were selected. We always have the image in our head from movies also and from the pictures of the Hungarian album from 1944 that the selection took place in Birkenau. That only happened in 1944. Before that, that happened on a siding along the main railway line. Now, right there is actually a tiny little monument. It's not part of the Auschwitz Museum. This is outside of the protected zone. This was created in a hurry around 25 years ago, when President of France, Chirac, wanted to make a visit to Auschwitz. And so this little memorial was created. And you see there a visitor looking at a sign, and you see a freight wagon parked there. But in fact, it's around 80% certain it's in the wrong location. If you compare aerial photos of that siding made during the war and actually the current arrangement of railway lines, is in fact, while that wagon was parked on the other side of the berm you see here on the right, that actually the berm itself that we have here was actually the platform where people were unloaded. But of course, it cannot be moved because this is a major railway corridor that's an active use. So in this case, we have a memorialized place, but a memorialized place that is around 50 meters away from the original place. So again, a problem in what actually is being preserved or reconstructed. If we're looking at the preserved part of Birkenau, which I said is around 2/3 of the original camp, again, we see that most of Birkenau, I mean, the famous gate, of course, everyone knows that. You can go up in the guard tower in the gate of Birkenau, and at first sight, you see there a row of so-called horse stable barracks that seem in good condition. They actually were all reconstructed. They were brought back to Birkenau. They were pulled down in 1945 to provide housing, both in the neighborhood, but also in Warsaw, to help in the reconstruction of Warsaw. This is also the reason that you see beyond all of these barracks, these chimneys. They are chimneys where barracks stood, but the barracks were taken away and never returned to Auschwitz after the war. So we have here a partially reconstructed landscape. Also on the other side, you see basically those kind of open graves almost, some of them with chimneys. But again, when they were wooden barracks and they could be taken away, most of them were taken away. We see a barrack to the left that actually was returned, which is of a different types. But thank God, the brick barracks that are of an earlier design phase created by Bauhaus trained architect Ertl are still there. They could not be moved in 1945. But typically they are in a terrible condition. Also, Oswiecim is an earthquake-prone region because of the kind of mining that's happening there. There are mines very close to Auschwitz-Birkenau. So recently, after an earthquake, many of these buildings were so far damaged that many were threatened to fall apart. And again, the Auschwitz Museum needs to undertake a heroic effort just to keep standing what is there right now. And of course, the question is, what do you do with a building, or in this case, a little oven, in this state of preservation? Do you keep it like that as a historical relic? Also, if you keep it like this, then of course, it's not very likely to be preserved in the future. The most difficult places for preservation are the location of the 4 crematoria in Birkenau, and I've indicated them here with the red dots. There are two types of crematoria. I'm first looking at crematorium number 2, which is the largest version of it. And this is a building that no attempt has been made to preserve anything at all. We're looking at the roof of the gas chamber. There is some kind of policy to try to stabilize this, but it's very difficult to stabilize ruins in this very extreme climate, especially with the thawing and the freezing in the winter. And basically, the decline of these of the crematoria, which basically are beyond in some way the moral scope of what you're allowed to touch, it's a real problem. You know, are these things are going to be there 10, 20, 50 years from now? And clearly the Auschwitz Museum, for good reasons, doesn't want to reconstruct them. So we have photos of them. We have here crematorium 2 shortly before its completion, with the gas chamber sticking out to the right of the chimney of the little engine. We have plans in the Auschwitz Museum, detailed plans. In fact, most of the architectural archive survives, which is unique for any of the German concentration camps. And this has to do with the fact that the architecture office closed a few months before the Russians arrived. If we look at crematorium number 4 and 5, and we're going to show the picture of crematorium number 4, again, we see a ruin that in this case, at least there were no basements below it. So it is a little bit more stabilized, but certainly the walls that we see here are reconstructions. All the walls had at a certain moment disappeared. So with some bricks that remained, these walls were again have been rebuilt to give a sense of the footprint of the building. But yeah, there is very little to see. And we have photos of these crematoria, the 2 smaller ones. Each was a cremation capacity of 750 people per day, while the larger ones were 1,500 people per day per piece. And again, we have blueprints. Now, we can of course visualize these crematoria through models. This is a model that actually belongs to an exhibition, the Evidence Room exhibition, which is owned by the Evidence Room Foundation. But of course, there is a larger version of this model, has been created in the 1950s and is on show in the Auschwitz Museum to show how these places operated. But a problem with the absence and the ruined state of the crematoria is, of course, that Holocaust deniers like Fred Leuchter here, an American engineer specializing in the construction, or at least in the 90s he was, and 80s, in the construction of execution equipment for the US prison systems, that is the states that use lethal execution as a punishment, that Holocaust deniers are basically arguing that there is no proof on the basis of the lack of evidence, and specifically on the basis of lack of evidence to be found in these buildings, that in fact the Holocaust did not happen. Their argument is a little bit like chaos theory. It's about, you know, when a butterfly flaps its wing in the Caribbean, you're going to have a storm in China, or it's the other way around. The idea is that if you cannot definitively show the murder weapon of the murder of over 1 million Jews and 100,000 non-Jews in Auschwitz, then in some way you cannot prove that the Holocaust happened at all. Now, you might think that this is all kind of very peripheral, but of course, in the age of Trump, nothing is peripheral anymore. And in some way, Holocaust denial as an early example of fake news is very much alive and well. So deniers go, for example, to places in Auschwitz, like this delousing chamber, to take samples from the walls. In this case, the blue stain, which is basically a ferrocyanide compound created by the impact of cyanide used for delousing on the iron in the plaster, and then compare that with samples they take from the quote-unquote alleged gas chambers, they say. And this is this has been a kind of an underground growth until, of course, it very much came to the surface when a well-known British writer on history, David Irving, publicly converted to what I call hardcore Holocaust denial. That is the statement that Auschwitz was not a extermination camp in 1988, and created a cottage industry out of it, and actually got many people interested in the theories. And we see to the back a photo that shows actually the ruined roof of Crematorium 2, which according to him was one of the main pieces of evidence that this space could never have functioned as a gas chamber. So all of this became basically the focus of Yad Vashem in the early 1990s, and also of Deborah Lipstadt, who then published in 1993 a book Denying the Holocaust, in which she singled out Irving as a particular a kind of important Holocaust denier, not because he had added to the discourse, but because he had a platform, he had a bullhorn, he had a readership. Then Irving sued Lipstadt for libel in a British court, and in a British court, the burden of defense is on the defendant. So Lipstadt decided to defend herself, and I had just published with Deborah book my monograph on Auschwitz, which was a kind of Ortsgeschichte, a history of the site. And so I was called in as a specialist in this trial to basically review the evidence about the genocidal use of Auschwitz. So one of the things that I did is I went again through all of the forensic investigations that were done in 1945 and 46 at the place. They were led by a Polish judge, Jan Zane. You see him right here in the center with a striped tie, and the man to the right with the basque beret. His name is Professor Rumkowski, who is an architect who analyzed especially the ovens and the crematoria ovens and the gas chambers. And I went over all the evidence that had been found at the time, much of it which disappeared since, like for example, this gas door, which was picked up by the Russians, with the perpetrator site, with the handles to close the door, and the peephole, and then the victim site, where the peephole is protected by an iron wire mesh. I went over all the testimonies that were given in 1945 and 46 before anything was published, most importantly by Henry Fuchsbrunner Tauber, who had a photographic mind. He was a Sonderkommando for 2 years in crematorium number 3. And he basically also oversaw the creation of the first reconstructions of the factory of death, with to the left the underground morgue that had been made into an undressing room, to the right morgue that had been transformed into a gas chamber with the 4 gas columns, and then above ground the incineration room with the incinerators. During the trial, I prepared a set of drawings to basically present to the court. I was cross-examined for 3 days in a row, and then another 2 days on individual questions. And this was the kind of material that I presented to the court to explain what happened, how these gas chambers were constructed, with, in this case, very importantly, ventilation systems in the walls, with structural columns carrying a beam in the center, and then what I call gas columns to the left and the center of the structural columns. This was a section, and the gas columns were basically means to not only introduce zyklon, which comes as a kind of material that evaporates cyanide into the space of the gas chamber from above, but more importantly, to remove the still degassing zyklon after everyone has been murdered, after everyone has died, so that then the ventilation system can be turned on, and you see it located in the walls, and the cleaning up of the gas chamber can start by the Sonderkommandos, and then of course the incineration can start. The problem is that these gas columns did not survive the war. They are not shown in the original blueprints of the buildings. They were added later, at least in the later design phase. And this is one of the reasons for the Holocaust deniers, that they never existed, that they are just a figment of the imagination. So I did forensic research, trying through convergent evidence to show that these things existed. For example, this photo of the top of the crematorium is the top of the gas chamber, where we see these box-like structures, which actually are the top of the gas columns that are visible in the photo, or looking at aerial photos of Birkenau, looking in this case in detail to crematorium number 3. looking actually at these dots on top of what became the gas chamber. You see there in a zigzag pattern indicated by the yellow arrows. And then the visual testimony by a surviving Sonderkommando, David Olaire, a French painter, and he shows in the plan that he draws in 1945, shortly after his return to Paris, he shows the gas columns again in a zigzag pattern, which is the result of them being that they have to be to the left and the right of the structural columns. They cannot cut the beam. Or looking at other archaeological evidence, in this case, the rebars to reconstruct in the ruined slab of the roof of the crematorium places where purposefully built holes had been created, which then allows us in that ruined slab to locate the holes through which the tops of the gas chambers came into the air. And these, they became the points of entry for the cyclone, the introduction points. I wrote all of this up in a book. We won, of course, the case. Lipstadt won the case on all points, also on all the forensic points relating to Auschwitz. Wrote a book about it, The Case for Auschwitz, which, by the way, got an award for the worst title of the year 2002. And in 2007, I got a visit of this man, Alejandro Aravena, who came to Waterloo to give a lecture. I gave him a copy of the book, and he sent me a nice little note how much he had, quote unquote, enjoyed reading the book, which was about the greatest crime ever created by an architect. But then he again contacted me in 2015 and he said, guess what? I have become the curator for the Venice 2016 Biennale, and I would like to have a presentation on the forensic investigation on the crematoria in my exhibition. So he offered to me in the International Pavilion, the pink room or the red room. Importantly was that he also had a second exhibition on forensic architecture, which was for a group led by Eyal Weizmann, who many of you probably know of, who is of Israeli origin but lives now in London. And he runs a forensic architecture group at Goldsmiths College, a very important group, very important work. He focuses very much on other human rights violations than the Nazis. So we have in some way divided the field. So in any case, there were two forensic architecture exhibitions in that Biennale. So we decided early on, and I will just introduce to me my collaborators, to create something which we called an evidence room. And the evidence room, of course, exists in police offices, precincts to preserve the evidence of crimes, but also to in some way refer back to the courtroom. That was very important to Aravena, the courtroom where the case had been heard. To these rooms where samples had been taken in Auschwitz, particularly, of course, also the gas chambers where the victims were murdered. And something that brings me back to my own graduate student days. I was a student of Francis Yates at the Warburg Institute, and basically learned a lot about memory theaters, particularly one memory theater created in Venice in the early 16th century by Giulio Camillo. So basically my two collaborators, I had a whole group of students, but my two colleagues at the University of Waterloo who helped create this project was Donald Mackay, who in some way was the chief operational officer and also the architect of the whole operation, and Anne Bordelot, who was in charge of creating the cast, that is in some way we could call it the artistic contents, around 80 casts of pieces of evidence that are displayed in this room. So the concept of the room is very simple. And here, these drawings were made by Mackay. 3 monuments. These were the 3 major pieces that were contested in the Irving trial. That is the gas door. And you will recognize one of the photos that I showed you before, of which the door actually has disappeared. There's another door in the Auschwitz Museum, and not this one. A gas hatch with a ladder of crematorium 5, the way Zyklon was introduced in the above ground gas chambers of crematorium 4 and 5, and a gas column from crematorium 2 and 3, which doesn't exist anymore and which we reconstructed for the purposes of this exhibition. It would be surrounded in this room that was given to us by the evidence for their existence. That was the evidence as it was introduced in the trial. And the evidence was going to be introduced by means of plasters. And then ultimately, everything was going to be connected into a single room. So it becomes like a Wunderkammer, a Renaissance, a single space. Instead of having evidence in a room, it was going to be evidence room. It was going to be a unified presentation. So we found a group of students who were willing to work with us. Here we have Michael Nugent, who volunteered to make the gas columns, which was certainly, when he started to learn more about them, somewhat harrowing task. Donald Mackay actually took charge of the final reconstruction of the gas columns with all the historical input that I could bring in, but Michael made those gas columns. Brad Paddock creating the gas door of recycled wood of a barn in Ontario. And here we have Anna Bezeknova and Anna Longerich. It seemed to be that most of the women on the project were called Anna, basically experimenting with making plasters. How do you make plasters of drawings? How do you make plasters of letters, of minutes, and so on? So let me talk for a moment on plasters and the use of plasters in evidence. So here we have a typical footprint in the sand that would be left by let's call it a burglar in a house. The police comes later, needs to preserve the footprint and pours plaster in it. Plaster is one of the oldest materials that is used to preserve forensic evidence. The death mask, in this case, it could be of a famous person, but it also can be of a person who was murdered or foul play is suspected in his or her death. Plaster, of course, used in this case in Pompeii to basically, of course, people died, animals died in Pompeii due to the eruption of the Vesuvius. And this is a dog. Of course, the dog died, but the ashes basically consolidated, hardened around the body of the dog. So a void existed there until in the 19th century, archaeologists started to fill the void with plaster. And that's why we have now basically an image of this dog. This is all basically also part of Anne Bordelot's work and her research. And she really was in charge of this. Or for example, the tradition of the 19th century plaster courts. Here we have the Victoria and Albert Museum that allowed you to take basically art from one place to the other, in this case to the capital, without necessarily looting it, as it had been done with the Elgin marbles. So plaster is a way of basically translating, quite literally, historical evidence and historical pieces throughout the empire, for that matter. So this all then became a kind of an attempt, and really it was the plaster team which faced the biggest problems of how do you translate a two-dimensional photo into a three-dimensional plaster. Yeah, because that was the idea. It was going to be all plaster images. It was going to be a plaster room. It was a room about touch. There weren't going to be any black lines on white. It was going to be in the tradition of the 19th century plaster copy, an attempt to preserve and present the evidence. And of course, plasters in this case, relief is read by shadows. And we were addressing the shadows of the crematoria. So here we have the photo you've already seen. And we see here various attempts of how you actually can start almost, by dots or by lines or whatever like that, to interpret that photo into something that becomes a three-dimensional image. And so let's go back to this photo of crematorium number 2, very important piece of evidence in the trial. And this is the plaster that resulted from it, which became part of the exhibition. The idea was that the visitors would be allowed to touch it, actually encouraged to touch it, and that it was really through the touch that they would discover the sense of this work. Also, of course, that forensic investigation is always in a way that the evidence doesn't scream at you. You have to find it. The evidence whispers at you. And so the idea is also that the plaster whispers at you. So here, 3 plasters to compare. The changing with the way the door into what's originally a morgue opens inwards, downwards in the left plaster to the left, and then at a certain moment it opens outwards, upwards in another blueprint, which is created at the time that the space has been modified into a gas chamber. There are obvious reasons why you don't want to have doors opening inwards into a gas chamber, because when the gas comes in, the victims will tend to run towards the door. So you cannot literally open the door because people have died in front of the door, and in the middle and in between situation. So plasters allow the visitor to reconstruct in some way the investigation. Here, a blueprint for crematorium number 4, the original blueprint, and then its plaster copy. Very important in this case that whatever seems to be dark lines are actually shadows. So the whole thing is white on white on white. And you actually have to move your body to actually discover all the dimensions, because the shadow also strangely starts moving because your body reflects the light differently. And this is very important actually in the experience of seeing these plasters. You cannot actually get it in a single glance. And this is also why you see people using their hands, moving their body, looking at it from different angles. So March 2016, Ontario still in the winter, 12 big boxes go in the truck, arrive a week later, thanks to DHL in Venice. The team arrives to build it. And as you're in Tel Aviv, the second person from the right, Piper Birnbaum, now professor at Carleton University, but she works with the Israeli program and takes everything every year, a group of students to Israel as part of the Israeli student. She was very important in this exercise, more or less a general coordinator. The construction of the framework in which the plasters are to be placed and the creation of the room. The pleasant surprise when we come out of the boxes that they haven't broken in transit. The single one, not a single one, was actually broken. The construction of the room. This is, I think, earlier on the day that we actually cleaned it up. And the final room as it existed in Venice. You see, in this case, the victim side of the door. The two sides of the door actually separated, the victim side and the perpetrator side. We basically say they belong to different worlds. And I actually took an interpretation by Maimonides of the entrance to the Holy of Holies of the temple as an inspiration to separate the door into two doors, in this case, the gas column and the gas heads in the back and the plasters on the wall. When the lights turned on the day that I had expected many different things, but one association I hadn't expected when the lights finally went on and the thing was seen in the way we had imagined it, is that I actually felt that I was in the brain of the architect, that this was a kind of Platonic world of these buildings. As they had been, they're like the shadow after they had been destroyed, but also they were in a sense as they were imagined, in this case by architect Walter de Jaco. So looking again at the architects, the reason I came to this, because I'm interested in crimes by architects. This is the architecture office at Auschwitz in 1943. This is the plaster that we created of them. We go back to them. Look at this architect, Fritz Ertl, our Bauhaus graduate. This is the building where he got his education. And of course, this is the part of the Bauhaus we like to remember. But Auschwitz is also part of it. So since then, the evidence room has had two other incarnations. We expanded it with two rooms, an anteroom. You see here the anteroom for the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. Also, we rearranged, we created a standing plan of urban plan of Birkenau to actually locate the important pieces that are the crematorium number 3, most importantly. And of course, we had a somewhat different condition. So the room actually has a different path through it now in the Toronto version. You come in through the sides and not through the center on the long walls, but it's actually quite flexible. And we have here looking back to the model of crematorium 2 that we created also to in some way give more of an explanation. And ultimately here the photo of what is the key detail, that is the basket with Zyklon B that was lowered into the gas chamber. And of course that wire mesh surrounding 2 wire mesh columns make it impossible for the victims to interfere with this process. And here the final incarnation in the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. Last year. This has been the last time that the evidence room has been shown. It is now in the possession of the Evidence Room Foundation, which is an American charity based in Delaware. And I guess that if there's a home for the evidence room in a white city, it would be quite an appropriate match. And I think the Evidence Room Foundation would be quite happy to talk about it. So that's my presentation right now, and I'm very happy to engage in a discussion, answer questions, and have a good time.
So Robert, thank you so much for this lecture. It was unbelievable. There's so much information one needs to really grasp in order to understand the depth of all your work. You have talked a lot about your wish to sort of approach those Holocaust deniers and with your work prove that Auschwitz actually happened. But I would like to focus also on another issue of your work, and this is you as a curator, as a storyteller. I would like to ask you how you as a curator and a professor for architecture approach the idea of commemorance, the idea of narrating a story to tell now to future generations, especially of course now when, you know, as we said before, a lot of this generation is perished already. So what is your approach as a curator, for example, regarding artifacts and the use of artifacts and their authenticity, for example, for this narration of an exhibition?
Now, first of all, so I have another exhibition, as you said, in New York right now. It's going to Kansas after that. And this is an exhibition that has 750 authentic artifacts. Yeah? And many of them coming from the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum, which has been a remarkable partner in this whole enterprise, but also from survivors. I mean, typically what you have in the case of, for example, Auschwitz, that the artifacts that were left in Auschwitz in 1945 were found by the Red Army are mostly artifacts without stories. That is, these are the mountain of shoes, hair, whatever, suitcases and so on, except for the Germans, like a desk of Hus. And the artifacts that were carried out of the camp by people on the death march are typically artifacts that come with a story. They were, when they survived the war, they ended up in America, in Tel Aviv, in Amsterdam, and then they give that artifact to their children or to a museum, but there's always a story connected to it. It's very interesting for me as a curator that you play, in this case, in the case of Auschwitz, artifacts with stories against artifacts without stories. The artifacts with stories are important to create a large narrative, but the artifacts without stories, let's call it the shoes in Auschwitz, are very good to basically create forensic interpretations of it, to allow people to do the work themselves instead of listening to a story told by somebody else. You know, traditionally in Holocaust centers, you know, until now it has been the survivor telling his or her story, but to put actually people at work to do the work itself, to be the Sherlock Holmes for a moment. And it's very important, I think, to work this art, to create a dialectic between the artifacts with stories and the artifacts with a kind of forensic potential. Also very important sometimes to play against each other artifacts that come in masses. You know, in the case of Auschwitz, you know, hundreds of thousands of buttons, you know, which were taken of garments, and the artifacts that are unique, of there is a single piece. How do you work against that? Because in the history of the Holocaust, Simultaneously, we have to keep in mind, of course, the scale of the catastrophe, the scale of the murder. In case of Auschwitz, more than 1 million human beings. In the case of the Holocaust as a general, the 6 million, and the fact it's 6 million individual pieces. Both things have to be kept at the same time, and artifacts function differently. The big problem, of course, of the Holocaust from a curatorial point of view is that it's a void, that essentially it is a void. That it is, and postmodernists, serious have commented on that it is like, that it not only destroyed, it's a volcanic eruption that not only destroyed the volcano, but even all the instruments that were put on the volcano to measure basically the eruption. And so how do you actually deal with the absence that the Holocaust represents, the absence of 6 million people, the absence basically of a large part of European Jewish culture, which was also destroyed. And of course, Dan Michman of Yad Vashem and until recently Bar Ilan University always will remind people the Holocaust is not simply about the murder of Jews, but it's also about the targeted destruction of Jewish culture and civilization and the memory of that. And in the case of Auschwitz, of course, this becomes very interesting because the crematoria are actually the point where presence and absence meets. They're not there anymore, and they're not actually preserved in a sense, but they are there. And so that's what makes them so interesting. And it makes them also so interesting because they're right at that point where our artifact with stories and artifacts that need to be forensically investigated. The presence of the Holocaust as 6 million murders and the absence of 6 million people and so on, all of that in some way comes together in the place of the 4 crematoria. And this, of course, then makes the issue of translating that into a room that tries to in some way preserve that relationship of absence and presence, the many and the single, the unique piece. And that's very much how we composed it. 3 unique pieces, and then in some way all of those pieces of evidence which become the chorus in the Greek drama that in some way creates the context for the 3 pieces to basically talk, if you just ask them nicely enough.
Okay, thank you for this answer. I would still want to go a little bit more in depth because, you know, we as visitors of museums are also, of course, youngsters are so used to, you know, pressing a button and something interactive happens and you get fed by a spoon, you know, and you were so used to that. How do we make people like investigate forensically, as you say, themselves? How do we like make them see the authenticity rather than this, you know, theme park conservation that you referred to in one of your articles?
Now, I always feel there's a difference between touching people and moving people. You're touching, it's very light. Yeah, touching is with empathy. Moving, what many museum curators do, or certainly in Holocaust education, there is a great fear amongst Holocaust educators, and there's a great fear amongst curators of Holocaust museum that people get the wrong picture, that people are going to be mistaken. For God's sake, if they think only 2 million Jews were killed, we need to make sure that everyone gets, you know, that they get exactly the right facts all the time. Let there be no confusion. This in some ways seems to be the first commandment of Holocaust education, you know. And I think that actually is the wrong way to go about it. I mean, if you're that tense about the engaging with the next generation or with people who do not know it, I think you shouldn't be in this business. I think it is all about, in some way, getting people interested by raising questions. One of the interesting things about the evidence room, which I observed many times in Venice because I was there longer, is that people, because there was a path through the evidence room, and the evidence room wasn't as light as the 2 rooms on each side. They were big double height spaces with a lot of light. So when you're in the one room and you look into the door of the evidence room, you don't see the evidence room because Donald Mackay made the early decision, we're not going to put the gas column right in the center. It would be possible when you enter the evidence room just to walk through the evidence through the other light room, which many people did, so that in some way we are not, in the Biennale, everyone was waving at you, look at me, I'm important, I have something to say. It is as if the whole Biennale is full of neon sign exhibitions. And we wanted to exactly not do that. So many people would walk through, didn't even notice the thing. And then they come into the other room, and then some of them come back. They start looking at it. And maybe a third try, they actually see it. And that, I think, is the key of how to handle this material. Trust the people who want to know something, to at a certain moment return to it, even if they've ignored it originally, because the topic, the material is compelling enough. So if you trust in the material that you have and you trust in the people, I think that you do not need to manipulate anything.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a lot of questions from the audience. I think Ines Weitzman also, she raised a hand. Ines, if you want to join the conversation, please do. Otherwise, oh yes, here's Ines. Oh no, Eyal. Eyal.
Hi, I'm Ines's husband.
Hi.
My name
you
is
were
Eyal.
mentioned before. We know you already.
Hi, Jack.
This is what husbands do.
Thank you very much, Robert Jan, for another fantastic lecture. I wanted to ask you, Robert Jan, about the mechanism of negation and denial as they compare to today's fake news. Now, you mentioned it. It seems to me that the mechanism of contestation is somewhat, perhaps it has some similarity, but importantly, there are some differences in it. So how doubt is mobilized, how doubt is weaponized, and how can we learn from the way in which truth is reestablished out of its ruin, political ruin today, from you to what lesson does it give us when we are confronting the politicization of lies and doubts?
I think that Hannah Arendt reflects on this actually deeply in a very famous essay that she writes in 1967 in the New Yorker. It's called Truth and Politics. And she says that nothing is as fragile as the truth. And the reason for that is that a liar can say anything. The truth is very particular. I mean, you're sitting right now, I guess in a cab somewhere in London, trying to get your last shopping done before the lockdown. I'm just making it up right now. But we could make 1,000 stories about what you're doing in this cab right now, but there's only one truth. Yeah. And it's very difficult actually to prove that you're sitting in that cab in London right now, for me right now. But lies are infinitely, they can morph into anything. But what Hannah Arendt observes, and I think this needs to be the point of departure for any discussion of what to do, is that nothing actually can replace the truth as a foundation. Yeah, that you cannot, in the end, I mean, the liar knows that. The liar knows that, I mean, when I was a little boy, I lied about a few things more than I do now. My lies today are white lies, but once you create a lie, you need to create a second lie to support the first lie. Then you need a third lie to support two lies. It becomes the lies create a chaotic universe in which you lose all basically benchmarks of action. And this ultimately will defeat the liar. So you have to, the truth in some way, which is my relationship with you, there is a truth in it. And the truth in is that, yes, we have been rivals maybe, but we're also collaborators. We're both together in the Advanced Biennale, but we also decided early on to separate our two exhibitions for clear reasons. Yeah. So this is a truth, and we can work on the basis of this truth, and we can be friends. And this goes, I think, for politics. This goes for international negotiations. If you try to build any reality on lies, you're building on quicksand. So that is, you have to take the long-term view. I think that the whole idea, and this goes back to having trust ultimately in the world, and that is, I think, the key problem that comes out of the Holocaust. Do you still trust the world or not? Because the Nazis under totalitarianism basically tried to destroy the ability of trust in the world by gaslighting everything. So in some way, as a historian, I'm not a politician, I don't know how to act in the real world, but taking the long view of history, there is this basic sense that you can trust historical evidence, that ultimately there is a tendency towards the truth in history, even when people lie continuously. And that, of course, is something also that Burckhardt said. I'm a cultural historian. Our hero is Jacob Burckhardt, who invented cultural history. And he said the Greeks tell the truth, not even when they lie, but especially when they lie. Yeah. And so this is the perspective that I take on this big thing. And I guess it's not very practical, but it helps me in coping with this.
Thank you.
It does help. It does help in coping. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
I guess that, my question, I suppose there are many other people wanting to ask, and I want to continue. I'll wait for Sharon to say if I'm allowed to continue or not, or she has a larger queue of people. Okay, if I don't hear, I'll say. So
please,
firstly,
please continue.
May I? Okay, thank you, Sharon. So firstly, I'd say that I think in Arendt's text that you refer to, she makes also quite an important nuance in which he is separating the politician from the historian. The politician as a creator of world and situation, to a certain extent, gets some leverage in not speaking, in not describing the fact as they are. So this is one thing. The second is really the place of the detail within the whole. And I think this is a kind of a lesson that one could have from Holocaust deniers. And I speak as a reader, as a close reader of your work, and indeed, never as a rival, always as a collaborator from my perspective, is what I've learned from you is that when a debate is actually fixated on one particular detail, the ability to manipulate any kind of scientific doubt, and in fact, scientific doubt is very part of the very nature of evidence, is possible. Whereas what I've learned from you is that evidence is always a kind of a set of relation between a big and multiple amounts of bits of evidence. It's a network. And I think that is one of the important things. Okay, we arrived somehow.
I think that the evidence, and this is also what Burckhardt says, that ultimately truth is a constellation. Yeah, truth is not a single thing; it's a constellation of things. We've lost him.
Yeah.
Yes, we've lost him in London.
We're here. But
okay.
Anyway, I think Sharon should really open it up to many other curious people in the audience who enjoy this talk. And this was really just to say hi.
Hi.
And kind of grab the phone from Ines. It was actually her. She was on it. Okay, Robert Jan, was great to see you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you for your contribution. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So going back to questions from the audience, I think it deals with another topic because, the field is very wide. There is a question from Alex B. Is there any other ways you have been taught to present those memorials except touching physical models? I think he refers to the plaster models that you're doing.
Now, I believe touch is the most important. It's certainly the most important sense, especially when you deal with the Holocaust, and that is that I do believe that that eyesight, that vision, is actually a sense in which the subject-object split is most present. that we always are objectifying whatever we are looking at. And it's very clear that the way we experience the world, for example, through our ears by hearing, is a much more intimate way. And the touch is even more intimate than listening to things. So in a sense, I am very fascinated by touch. And this is what really in Anne Bordelow's practice with the casts really I found extremely fascinating. And I must say that for me, the evidence room is primarily something that I still feel in my fingers as I'm sitting here. Now, we of course have in Holocaust education, if I for a moment put myself into Holocaust education, if we're talking now about the situation we're in right now, is we have the last, survivors who are dying. I mean, there's that generation will be gone in 10 years. And I think that one of the things that you quite often see when you engage, when Holocaust survivors are in groups with children or grown-ups or whatever, like they give their testimony, it actually becomes very physical. Yeah, it starts out being they are on one side of the classroom and the kids are on the other side of the classroom. But, in the end, it quite often becomes a hug fest. Yeah. People want to touch, people want to kiss, people want to put their arms around it. And I think, again, that is actually, and this, of course, is a natural response also when you actually hear about trauma, is that actually you do not want the eye to basically have the last word in it, but you literally want to touch the person as a kind of closing gesture. And so I think also that in a sense that when we're moving now in the post-survivor age, that simply to have monitors of video testimony of survivors is not going to do it. Yeah. And because we're going to lose that final gesture in which you smell the person, touch the person, stroke the person, whatever like that. And so I think that there, in that sense, I think that the video testimonies that have been created all over the world are fantastic. They're incredible resource, I think, for historians. But I think they're not going to replace very simply for that very reason, actually the experience of being with survivors and listening to their testimony, even when it's there. And the Shoah Foundation in Los Angeles is trying to have 3D, they have now created these hologram survivor testimony, but you cannot touch them. And it doesn't.
There's also, I must say, there's also, from a conservation architect's view, there is also the physical decay of things. It's not only, that people are dying that really experience it, that the physical elements will not survive, like you said, the shoes or anything like that. So it's also questions, do we recreate objects in order to commemorate them, or do we just, let the story get lost and decayed, with the element itself? From the physical manner, I think it's a very ethical question almost.
I don't want to be really kind of, pessimistic, but, the world is continuing to create horror after horror after horror after horror.
Yeah, that's true.
And the whole idea that, we're now in the middle, we're probably burning up the planet right now. And who knows what's going to erupt tomorrow after the US elections, So the idea that the Holocaust will be sitting there in its little sanctuary, untouched by, as this sacred thing, and nobody can, it will become like the First World War at a certain moment. And I think that we have to already mentally prepare ourselves for it, that with the death of there's this 70-year period Hobsbawm talks about, that things become history after 75 years. The Holocaust will become history in 25 years. Yeah, and that is going to, and it will force us, then it's a part of history like other pieces of history, and it's going to be in a constellation of other histories. And so what we've seen in the interpretation of the Holocaust is that, from 1945 to 1980, it was a detail in the Second World War. Then it flipped around, I guess in Israel, but especially also in North America and in much of Europe. The Second World War became a detail of the Holocaust. And now maybe it will flip back, or it will be some kind of a balance, because it will be within the First World War, the Second World War climate change, the American election, whatever, and it will find a place within that moving kind of landscape of historical issues we have to think about.
Yes, there's also another question from Tal Gazit, who is also a conservation architect. He asks if there's a complete picture or like a conservation plan of Auschwitz. Is there like a real plan of how to conserve Auschwitz in detail?
Yeah, I mean, the Auschwitz Conservation Department, certainly when we look at the items, at the artifacts, I would say for its thing, it's the best in the world. It's also very well financed. Their labs are fantastic. Their policies are great. For the buildings, it's more difficult because the buildings were very cheaply constructed. And as I said, it's an earthquake-prone reason because you have these enormous underground cavities in these mines there, and so there are constant earthquakes, but they do the very best they can. The problem is not in the part that the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum controls, that is the UNESCO zone and the place that's controlled. The problem is all around it, because Auschwitz, and that's what I tried to indicate at the beginning, the protected area, that is the museum area, is only a very, very small part. That first map that I showed is of the interest area. It was a 40 square kilometer area that was run by the camp. There were dozens of sub-camps in it. Right now, for example, there is a whole issue about a factory in which a commando called the Leather Factory, which is actually, more or less in Auschwitz town. It was a sub-camp of the camp. And they now want to make another shopping mall there. We get regularly these problems that your Auschwitz is right next to a prosperous town, relatively prosperous town. It's a developing town. There's enormous pressure on the periphery of the museum. You go to Birkenau, you look out and you see there the big parking lot with a visitor reception center that's very big. And you see a church and you see all kinds of economic developments happening, and they really cannot be controlled. You cannot musealize the whole region. And that's where the problem is. And that's why I started my talk with talking about the stuff that's not in the camp, but it's actually very important to understand the history of the camp. And that is decaying. And then sometimes you can quote unquote rescue a piece like the barrack that we got for the New York exhibition, which is now restored, and it will be returned to the Auschwitz Museum as an artifact. They supported us exporting it after the exhibition is done. So you can rescue one piece. But there's too much, and there's too much development happening. And so you have to make, there's a triage there.
May I ask a question relating to what Robert just spoke about?
Sure.
May I jump in? Thank you. Hi, my name's Tammy. I wanted to ask you, you began your talk speaking about those areas which are not protected. And we all understand that immediately after the war, the site was obviously under Soviet control. And we also understand the original museum that opened was very through Soviet eyes, the way they represented Auschwitz. So now that we come to 2020, I just wanted to understand, it's very well known, all those areas that are not included within the heritage site. So first part of my question is, who actually established the original parameters of what was going to be heritage protected? From which political body actually established, where do we stop this railway line, that building, but not that building?
That's the Polish Parliament. The boundaries were owned by the Polish Parliament in 1947, the same. And then there is a second thing that was created, was by UNESCO. So UNESCO does not, as a matter of principle, recognize places of human martyrdom, suffering, and so on as culturally important sites, but they made an exception for Auschwitz in 1979. So then basically the UNESCO site was created, which was slightly larger than I would say 50% larger than the museum site, but it doesn't actually connect the two sites. So the railway corridor goes in between them. And of course, the UNESCO recognition doesn't give any funds or doesn't give anything to actually help preserve anything within that site.
Right. So it actually totally relates to that idea of absence and presence, when every side of difficult history has glaringly at you absence and presence, what we reveal, what we conceal, and how we link the evidence and the physical site to the events. So inherently we are missing parts of the narrative, and it creates more holes in terms of our curatorial path when people go and visit. And we do have, like, for me personally, I think this year when I watched the memorial ceremonies on Holocaust Memorial Day, I you know, it was the best time I've ever seen Auschwitz, for want of a better term, not to put it that way. But for me, the absence of the hype and the fanfare and simple imagery of voices and photographs in a completely ghost-like town was the heaviest impact of memorializing from my perspective. I thought it was really interesting. And the down point of the visitor experience for so many people when they do go to Auschwitz is this talk of the buses and the lines, and there was sort of everyone there, and can you believe someone was eating a sandwich next to me, and all these things that can be so frustrating for visitors to the site.
I actually have I'm relatively relaxed about it. I mean, Auschwitz is a tourist site. It cannot be but a tourist site because of the nature of today's tourist economy. Yeah, in a sense, you need to have the clean toilets there. You need to have the snack bar because people need lunch if they're going to spend the day there. You need the tourist guides. You need the audio tours.
I agree.
Safe. It needs to be safe, and that means and predictable. Yeah, if you go to Auschwitz now, unlike in 1944, you want to be sure that if you arrive at 10 o'clock, that at 3 o'clock you're out, that you can go to Krakow or to the salt mines or whatever like that. Yeah, so this is what tourist industry does very well. I think that actually the experience in Auschwitz when you're there is not that important. I think what happens
what you take away.
What happens afterwards, when you start rereading, when you start reading Primo Levi, when you talk with people about it, I think actually in general in experience, I think actually what we experience at the moment, maybe I have a very flat sense of ability to experience things, but I'm a storyteller. I mean, experience is just raw material for the story, yeah, I believe. And so I believe that the same applies to a visit to Auschwitz or to the evidence room or anything else, to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, for God's sake, except when you're really Orthodox. Yeah, it becomes pieces that become piece of a larger story that you're making. So every year I take people to Auschwitz, and people always are quote unquote disappointed. You know, there is something really when you come from North America, you know, with a relatively secular pieces, and you see an Israeli group of kids with Israeli flags dancing the horror on the top of the roof of the gas chamber. Yeah. Now, if you want to get me very angry and sick, that's the scene. But I understand why it happens. I certainly understand why it happens. Yeah. But by the way, I love the book, The Memory Monster, which, you know, was recently translated in English, which is about that travel culture. But I also think that ultimately these are all part of living in 2020, you know, with crazy secularists and crazy Zionists and crazy religious people. We're all crazy in our own way. And everyone looks at our behaviors in display and thinks, what are these people doing? Yeah? So then I think, okay, you know, it's a difficult mosaic of things. And at home, I will try to make sense of it. That's the important. I think
essentially, it's our job as curators to provoke the visitor. We must provoke them to think the next thought, to be curious about whatever it was that I saw that bothered me about the gas chambers, or so on and so forth.
Yeah, and trust people.
Mm.
Okay, guys, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are out of time. So thank you very much for participating. Another remark, it's not a question, but it's a remark which I must share from Shamir, which says that recently a shoe was found in Auschwitz that belonged to her father, and also a suitcase was found, and this is going to be presented at a Holocaust Museum today. Yes, please.
It's a shoe of our brother. I have a brother from the same father, but the wife and the child who was 6 years old, his name was Amos Steinberg. And 2 months ago or 3 months ago, suddenly I saw in the newspaper that they identified it. They took it out from the wall and they showed the name of and they identified the name of the child as Amos Steinberg. It was there for several years. And they were so excited about the fact that we could tell them the story. around this boy that was murdered when he was 6 years old with his mother. My father survived Auschwitz. He was released from Kaufering. And a few days later, the head of the Auschwitz Museum wrote me a very nice letter. And he said that he identified also my father's suitcase. His name was Ludwig Steinberg. And he has a room, obviously, of lots of suitcases. He identified it. And they were so excited about the fact that now they can put the whole story of the family, what happened to the family. It was a family from Prague. We were born in Prague, and that were moved from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz, and the story was that we knew all the years about our brother, but the fact that they identified the shoe among other million shoes made them very excited. And actually, I got a very interesting book that was written by the head of the museum, the Auschwitz Museum. And I think the spirit of what you were talking about is really in this book about what does it mean to be the general manager of the Auschwitz Museum. It's a beautiful book. It's written very nice, and the pictures are very, very nice, very moving and very touching. And now everybody that will come there will know the story of this child, his father. And somebody asked me, don't you ask for this shoe, or don't you ask for this luggage? And I said, no, 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 it will be in Auschwitz. And I hope that for many years people will see and will be witness to this story of this child, which connected very much to what Mr. Robert talked throughout this lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this bit of, you know, at the end of his novel, The Last of the Just André Schwarz-Bart, one of the earliest novels on the Holocaust, that sometimes a drop of compassion will drop from heaven. So I think this story is a little drop of compassion. So I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Leah, for sharing. It's very emotional. Of course, we talk about artifacts, but in the end of the day, every single piece of evidence, if it's a button or a hair, is connected to a story, and we're, you know, all sharing this story as a culture. So it's really our identity. So thank you, Mats, very much, Leah. Yes, actually, if we're talking about personal things, I also just recently learned that my grandfather was actually from Auschwitz. So he was in the town of Auschwitz before it was a camp. So there must have been Jewish life there before.
And then I asked, do you have artifacts? Because we,
yes.
of course, you know, because we told actually our story. The exhibition that's now in New York, originally made in Madrid by Spanish company Musealia from San Sebastian. We actually root the whole story in Oswiecim. And we follow the stories also of Jewish inhabitants from Oswiecim who then go into the world and then are deported back in 1943 back to Auschwitz. Yeah?
Yes.
And that, of course, is the infernal kind of the infernal tragedy that happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, Robert. I would want to continue speaking to you like a lot more. Like there's also a lot of more questions from the audience, but unfortunately we are already half an hour past our time. I didn't even notice.
Okay.
So
thank you.
I don't know how to thank you for this. It was a great contribution, and I will keep my eyes and ears open to see if we can find a place for the evidence room, because I think your work is so important. And I wish that we can help you with that. And also we would like to, you know, really hope that you can come with your students or yourself to the Lieblinghaus, the White City Center. We would love to host you and do projects with you. So whenever you're here, please let us know. So thank you, Robert, so much for joining, and we hope to see you again. For everybody who's still here, next week we have a total different topic. We're talking about strategic urban planning and density. So it's the Strategic Urban Planning Department of the Municipality of Tel Aviv, Chagit Naali Yosef and Eyal Ronen, who are talking about urbanism and where it's facing in terms of density. This is our first part, and then the second part will be a movie by a Swiss architect called I Am Gentrification, who's gonna show what is going on in Zurich in that matter as well. And then we'll have a talk to the architect who made the film. So I really invite you for the next 2 sessions. And there's also, Robert, if you're still here, there is a link to, maybe I can connect you to somebody who's interested in the White Room already. So here we are. And I would want to thank everybody who's still here. I know it was a very, very interesting, but very sentimental topic. So thank you everybody for listening and being with us. And I hope to see you again in our lectures, and have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.